Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back into the mists of prehistory. So, if you haven't already, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab some tea you'll inevitably forget to drink. And let's talk about one of the oldest bedtime stories humans ever told each other. A story about way too much water now. I don't want to alarm you, but according to basically every ancient culture ever, at some point the gods got really tired of people, which is fair, honestly. If you've ever tried to host a dinner party and someone spilled wine on your new rug, you know the vibe. The gods' solution was not just to send everyone home politely. No, they went for the nuclear option. Or, in their case, the hydrological option. They unleashed a flood. You've probably heard of Noah's Ark, right? Big boat, 2 of every animal, rainbow at the end. But here's the fun part. The Bible was not exactly innovating with that story. Flood myths pop up pretty much everywhere. Ancient Mesopotamia had them. India had them. The Greeks had them. Even the Maya and the Chinese. It's like humanity's favorite bedtime horror story. Once upon a time, everything you love got drowned. Sweet dreams, kids. But tonight we're not just retelling myths in Sunday school style. We're going to float gently through the background, the characters, and the odd details that made these tales stick for thousands of years. And we'll see how they overlap, contradict each other, and occasionally make absolutely no sense. Because history is always a little messy. So, let's start in Mesopotamia. Because if there's one place that could never get enough of a good flood story, it's the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. Our first stop is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which, fun fact, is one of the oldest pieces of literature humanity has ever scribbled down. Written on clay tablets, because paper was still just a twinkle in some papyrus plant's eye. Buried in this epic tale of heroic quests and random tangents is a flood story. Gilgamesh, who is basically Sumerians' idea of a celebrity demigod, goes on a midlife crisis journey to find the secret of immortality. Along the way, he meets That name might not ring a bell, but think of him as Mesopotamia's Noah, Utnapishtim tells. Gilgamesh, how the gods once decided to wipe out humanity with a flood, because humans were just too noisy. Yes, noisy. That was the divine complaint. Apparently, eternal deities couldn't handle the prehistoric equivalent of loud neighbors, so one god, Ea, whispered a little tip to Utnapishtim. Hey buddy, maybe build yourself a big boat. And like any reasonable man hearing secret advice from a god, he went ahead and did it. He loaded his family, craftsmen, and beckers, why not every kind of animal he could manage. When the flood came, it was described as so terrifying that the gods themselves cowered like dogs, which, if nothing else, makes you feel slightly less bad about crying during Finding Nemo. Even deities get overwhelmed sometimes. Eventually the waters receded. Utnapishtim's boat got stuck on a mountain. He sent out a dove, a swallow, and a raven to check if the land was dry. Classic bird-based reconnaissance. When the raven didn't come back, he knew it had found land. So he unloaded, sacrificed to the gods, and was rewarded with immortality. Basically the Mesopotamian version of a loyalty program. Sound familiar? That's because this story is almost identical to the later Hebrew version in Genesis. The names are different, the mountain is different, but the plot line is basically copy-paste with light editing. Now let's float over to Greece. They also loved a good aquatic apocalypse. Their flood star was Deucalion. He was the son of Promethoi Zuno, the guy who stole fire for humanity and got sentenced to liver-pecking duty. Prometheus, apparently tired of being punished, decided to do something useful for once and tipped off his son that Zeus was planning to flood the world. Why was Zeus mad? Pick a reason. People were disrespectful, ungrateful, or maybe someone forgot to send him a proper goat sacrifice. The myths aren't entirely clear, because with Zeus, literally everything set him off. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrhic built themselves a Cestopasically, a big wooden box, like the IKEA starter pack version of an ark. The flood came, wiped out everyone else, and when the waters receded, they landed on Mount Parnassus. Now, here's where it gets weird. They were the last humans alive, which is awkward if you're a married couple and need to repopulate the world. To solve this without too much incest discomfort, they got creative. They tossed stones over their shoulders, and the stones turned into new humans. Rocks from Deucalion became men, and rocks from Pyrrha became women, which is one way to handle a population crisis. Not exactly romantic, but effective. Moving East India has its own version, tucked inside Hindu texts. This one involves a little cosmic foreshadowing. A man named Manu was washing his hands in a river one day, as you do when a tiny fish begged him for protection. Manu, being either compassionate or bored, kept the fish in a jar. The fish grew bigger. He moved it to a pond. It grew again. Eventually, the fish was basically the aquatic equivalent of Godzilla. But holy, turns out the fish was actually the god Vishnu in disguise. Vishnu warned Manu that a flood was coming. Again, standard divine complaint. Humans had been misbehaving. Manu built a boat, tied it to the horn of the giant fish, and together they rode out the flood. When the waters settled, Manu offered a sacrifice and basically kick-started the human race all over again. So here, instead of a bird, we've got a giant talking fish as the savior. Pick your preference. And then there's China. But their flood story is slightly different. Instead of a one-off divine punishment, they describe a massive flood that lasted for years. This wasn't your weekend downpour. This was decades of water covering the land, swallowing homes, and generally making farming impossible. The hero here is you, the Great. He didn't survive by floating around on a boat. Instead, he engineered a massive system of channels and dikes to control the water. Imagine a mythic civil engineer who became emperor simply because he figured out drainage, which honestly is the most practical origin story of all these. You spent years walking the land, digging canals, rerouting rivers, and creating the foundation of Chinese civilization, while everyone else's flood. Myth ends with, and then people sacrifice to the gods. The Chinese version ends with, and then hydraulic. Engineering saved us, a very on-brand solution, so why do all these cultures have the same soggy bedtime story? There are a few theories. One is that massive floods did actually happen at the end of the last ice age. Melting glaciers, rising sea levels. Local catastrophist experienced them, remembered them, and turned them into myths. Another theory is simpler. Floods are universal. Every river valley civilization had to deal with them. They were terrifying, destructive, and uncontrollable. So, of course, people told stories about the biggest, scariest flood imaginable. The reset button flood. And finally, there's the symbolic angle. Floods wipe things clean. They destroy, but they also make room for a fresh start. So the myths gave people a way to imagine renewal after disaster. a cosmic spring cleaning, and that's where we'll pause this first stretch. We've floated through Mesopotamia's noise complaints, Greece's rock-throwing fertility trick, India's fish god Uber service, and China's civil engineering superhero. All versions of the same haunting memory, a time when water nearly erased humanity. So, we've paddled through the Mesopotamian, Greek, Indian, and Chinese versions of the Great Flood. Now it's time for the most famous one, the one that Sunday school teachers, children's books, and vaguely Christian-themed gift shops have milked for centuries. Yes, we're talking about Noah's Ark. Now. The funny thing about Noah's story is that everyone thinks they know it. Big boat, 2 of each animal. 40 days and nights of rain. Dove with an olive branch. Rainbow at the end. Done. Simple. But if you actually sit down and read the thing, it gets a little odd. And by odd, I mean it reads like 3 different writers got drunk, wrote slightly different drafts, and then mashed them together. Which, honestly, is kind of what happened. First, who was Noah? According to Genesis, Noah was the son of Lamech, which doesn't help much unless you're deeply into Old Testament genealogy charts. He's described as a righteous man in a wicked world. Basically, humanity had gone feral. Violence everywhere, corruption, people not listening to God. In short, it was like Twitter, but with more livestock. God looked at all this chaos and thought, yeah, let's just hit the reset button. But instead of starting over completely, he picked one guy and his family to preserve. Why Noah? We're told he walked with God, which sounds nice and pious, but in practice probably just meant he wasn't actively murdering his neighbors. Low bar. So, God gave him the task. Build an ark. Now, here's where things get quirky. The dimensions of the ark are given very precisely. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. If you're not fluent in cubits and really, who is that works out to something like 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Basically a floating warehouse, and it's not shaped like a boat, more like a big box, which makes sense because the goal wasn't sailing. It was just staying afloat while the apocalypse did its thing. But here's the detail most kids' picture books skip. The ark had 3 decks and a single window. One window. For 8 people, thousands of animals, and 40 days of storm. That ventilation situation must have been ripe. Also, God asked Noah to cover the entire thing with pitch, inside and out, which is ancient tar. So now you've got a giant, pitch-black, tar-smelling wooden box crammed with animals. Honestly, if this isn't the worst Airbnb of all time, I don't know what is. This is where the story starts contradicting itself. In one version, Noah is told to take 2 of every animal, male and female. Simple enough. That's the version everyone remembers. But in another version, he's told to take 7 pairs of clean animals and just 1 pair of unclean animals, which immediately raises questions. First, how did Noah know which animals counted as clean? This is before Moses, before Leviticus, before the whole kosher system. Was there a secret pre-apocalypse zoo classification chart? Second, why 7 pairs? Was God anticipating animal attrition? Like, better bring spares, the lions might snack on the sheep. Practical, but oddly specific. And third, the logistics. Let's just take a moment. Even if we're generous and assume the whole world meant the region Noah knew existed, we're still talking hundreds of species. Loading them onto a giant box boat, feeding them, cleaning up after them, all with 8 humans. I can barely keep a houseplant alive now. You might remember the rain lasted 40 days and nights, which it did. But that's not the whole story. After the rain stopped, the waters didn't just vanish. They lingered. According to Genesis, the floodwaters covered the earth for 150 days. Then they started to recede. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and even then, it took months before the land was dry enough to leave. When you add it all up, Noah and his family were on the ark for about a year, living in a giant tar-lined wooden box with your parents, your kids, their spouses, and a menagerie of anxious animals. Forget the apocalypses was the real punishment, to check if the flood was ending. Noah pulled a move straight from Utnapishtim's playbook. He sent out birds. First, a raven. It flew around but didn't return. Then a dove. It came back empty-beaked. He tried again a week later. This time, the dove returned with an olive leaf, signaling that land was emerging. Another week, and the dove didn't return at all. Classic, it found a better lease somewhere else scenario. That's when Noah finally opened the door and let everyone out. Animals scattered, the family breathed fresh air again, and Noah immediately built an altar and sacrificed some of the animals, which, if you've just spent a year keeping these creatures alive 2 by 2, feels like a pretty harsh betrayal. Congrats, you made it through the flood. Now, please hop on this altar. After the sacrifice, God made a covenant with Noah. He promised never to destroy the world by flood again. The sign of that promise was the rainbow, which is sweet until you realize rainbows are just physics. So, either God invented rainbows right then and there, or people had seen them before but didn't know they were divine branding. Either way, the rainbow became a sort of celestial post-it note, a reminder that, yes, everything was terrible, but it wouldn't get quite that watery again. Fire, brimstone, plagues, sure, but not water. Progress, I guess. Now, most people think the story ends there. Happy rainbow, animals roaming free, everyone's fine. But Genesis keeps going, and it gets awkward because once the family settled down, Noah planted a vineyard, which sounds wholesome, until he drank too much of his own wine, got blackout drunk, and passed out naked in his tent. Yep, humanity's fresh start after the apocalypse immediately devolved into a middle-aged dad embarrassing himself at a family cookout, one of his sons. Ham saw him passed out naked and apparently laughed or at least mentioned it to his brothers. The other 2 sons covered Noah up without looking. When Noah sobered up, he was so angry at Ham that he cursed Ham's son, Canaan. Not Ham, the grandson, because apparently Noah wasn't great at directing blame. This bizarre little episode has puzzled scholars for centuries. Why include it at all? The Ark story could have ended on a nice rainbow note. Instead, we get drunk Grandpa Noah and the curse of Canaan, which, if nothing else, reminds us that biblical figures were still very human. Flawed, messy, and occasionally ridiculous. What's fascinating here is how the Noah narrative borrows heavily from Mesopotamian traditions. The Ark dimensions, the birds, the mountain landing geats, almost a remix of Utnapishtim's tale. The Hebrew scribes basically took a story their neighbors were already telling and reframed it with their own theological spin. That's not plagiarism. That's how stories worked in the ancient world. Everyone recycled myths, adapted them, and gave them local flavor. It's why Zeus looks suspiciously like other storm gods, or why flood stories show up everywhere. humans passed down the same traumatic memories and cultural anxieties. Just swapping the names. The flood narrative isn't just about water. It's about control, chaos, and the fragile line between survival and oblivion. Ancient people knew floods. They destroyed crops, homes, entire communities. To explain them, they told stories. Stories where divine beings hit reset, where one chosen family survived, and where life could start again. And while today we don't expect an ark to float up our driveway, the resonance remains. Every culture that lived near a river or sea had its version. The flood was the ultimate reminder, no matter how clever humans thought they were. Nature and the gods always had the last word. So that's Noah's saga. More complex, more contradictory, and much less child-friendly than the coloring books let on. Next, we'll drift further into other regional flood myths, the strange archaeological theories that try to pin them on real events, and the ways later generations kept recycling these stories whenever they needed to explain disaster. So, we've floated through Mesopotamia, Greece, India, China, and the biblical Noah. By now, you might be wondering, was there ever an actual flood? Or are humans just really dramatic when it rains too much? Archaeologists, geologists, and the occasional conspiracy theorist have all tried to answer that. Spoiler, it's complicated. But let's gently paddle through the options. One of the most famous ideas popped up in the late 20th century. Two geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, suggested that the Black Sea used to be a freshwater lake. Then, around 5600 BCE, rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus Strait, flooding the region. Catastrophic ally. According to them, it wasn't just a little trickle. It was more like Niagara Falls on steroids. A torrent of seawater poured in, drowning villages, farms, and whatever unlucky goats happened to be grazing nearby. They argued that this event might have been the real-world inspiration for Near Eastern flood myths. Did everyone agree? Of course not. This is archaeology. Some said, yes, the flood happened, but maybe not quite as dramatic. Others said, actually, it was slow and gradual. And still others rolled their eyes and muttered something about academics loving headlines. Either way, the Black Sea theory remains one of those maybe, maybe not, ideas that keeps getting recycled in documentaries whenever producers need something watery to spice up their scripts. Another explanation goes back further, to the end of the last ice age. About 12,000 years ago, massive glaciers started melting. Sea levels rose dramatically, swallowing coastlines worldwide. Imagine living in a little fishing village, only to realize the ocean is creeping closer each year. Eventually, your house is underwater. That'll give your descendants something to talk about. In this version, there wasn't one single flood. Instead, countless communities around the world saw their homes drowned by rising seas. Each culture then preserved the trauma in story form, which explains why the myths are global. Flooding wasn't a one-time thing. It was an ongoing nightmare for early humans. And then there's the more modest, archaeological evidence in Mesopotamia itself. Excavations at sites like Shuruppak and Urantian Sumerian City-Shave turned up layers of river silt dating back to around 2900 BCE. Basically, mud deposits sandwiched between normal habitation layers. That means there was, indeed, a big flood that disrupted city life. Was it world-ending? Not really. But if your world was just your city and the farms around it, then yes, it felt apocalyptic. And stories of that event could easily grow into something mythic over centuries. Remember when the flood destroyed Yeah, that was the time the gods nearly wiped out everyone. Now, here's where things get fun. Kings loved to attach themselves to flood survivors, because nothing says divinely approved ruler like being able to claim your ancestors made it through humanity's biggest reset button in Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king Lister kind of exaggerated royal family tree starts with antediluvian kings. That's just a fancy way of saying before the flood. They supposedly reigned for thousands of years each. Because if you're going to make up history, why not go big? After the flood, the king list resets with new dynasties. Basically, it's a way of saying, sure, the gods destroyed everything, but our line was chosen to continue civilization. It's ancient propaganda with a watery twist. The Hebrews did something similar. The genealogies in Genesis link Noah directly to later patriarchs. That way, Israelite identity, flow-spun, intended straight from the one righteous man who survived the flood. Divine approval guaranteed. Even in Greece, kings liked to trace their descent back to Deucalion and Pyrrha. Because being the grandson of Zeus was nice, but being the literal founder of post-apocalyptic humanity, that's the kind of branding you can put on a coin. Meanwhile, flood stories popped up in other corners of the world. The Maya told of floods that ended successive ages of mankind. In Polynesia, some traditions speak of canoes carrying the survivors of giant inundations. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains had their own version, some involving rafts, others involving mountains that served as arks. Were these all connected? Maybe, or maybe, again, floods just happen a lot, and people everywhere came up with similar explanations. If your whole valley fills with water, you don't need cultural cross-pollination to start imagining divine punishment. You just need a soggy hut and a good memory. What's striking is how sticky these stories were. Thousands of years later, people were still retelling them, reshaping them, and attaching new morals. Floods were the ultimate metaphor. They destroyed everything, but they also allowed for rebirth. They punished humanity, but also purified it. For kings, they were a chance to say, see, our family line survived. We're the chosen ones. For ordinary people, they were a way to make sense of disasters that felt completely beyond control. And for us today, they're oddly soothing to revisit. Maybe because they remind us that humans have always been anxious about the world ending. And yet, somehow, here we still are. So, we've now covered the mythic versions, the biblical remix, and the archaeological attempts to pin a real flood to the stories. So, after the ancient world had finished telling and retelling its soggy bedtime stories, you'd think maybe people would move on, but no. In the Middle Ages, the flood story got recycled, embroidered, and written into just about every manuscript anyone with ink-stained fingers could get their hands on. Why? Well, because medieval scholars loved genealogy, allegory, and reminding everyone that they had the moral high ground. The flood ticked all those boxes. Monks, particularly in Europe, were absolutely obsessed with biblical chronology. They wanted to figure out when exactly the flood happened, how long it lasted, and how it fit into world history. Because apparently copying the Psalms by candlelight wasn't enough. Excitement, so you'll find manuscripts where monks sit down with Genesis and try to count the years from Adam to Noah. They'd do the math, scribble in the margins, and argue with each other over whether Methuselah died before the flood or during it. And yes, that was an actual debate. Scholars literally wasted quills, over whether one particularly old man drowned or not. The flood, for them, wasn't just a story. It was a keystone in world history. It divided the before times from the after times. Everything had to be neatly slotted on a divine timeline, of course. Monks weren't just accountants with robes. They also loved turning the flood into a moral allegory. Noah's Ark became a symbol for the church itself, the boat that carried the faithful through the storm of sin, which is nice until you remember how bad the ventilation must have been. But nobody was painting stained glass windows of that detail. Preachers would hammer the point, stay in the ark of faith, or you'll drown like the wicked. Very subtle. Nothing like guilting your flock with the image of their neighbors dog paddling outside a holy boat. Medieval Europe also had a thing for bestiarius siliestrad, catalogues of animals, real and imagined. Lions, elephants, unicorns, griffins, name it. And yes, they all got shoved into discussions of Noah's Ark. Because why not? Some monks seriously debated how Noah could have fit all these animals on the boat. Their solutions were creative. One argument was that God must have made the animals smaller for the trip, which is basically suggesting the Ark was an early experiment in shrink-ray technology. Another theory, Noah only took baby animals, which does solve the space issue, but also turns the Ark into history's weirdest daycare. And of course, the question of unicorns came up. Some bestiaries suggested they didn't make it onto the Ark, which is why we don't see them today, which is both adorable and tragic. If you imagine a unicorn just missing the boat while a donkey trots up the gangplank. Now, if you were a medieval ruler, you didn't just want to say you descended from some random noble. No, you wanted divine pedigree. And what better way to claim legitimacy than to tie yourself to Noah's family tree? European dynasties, especially the Franks and later the English, loved weaving their royal lines back to flood survivors. Supposedly, some of Noah's sons migrated out after the waters receded and eventually founded whole nations. Japheth, one of Noah's 3 sons, often got the credit for being the ancestor of Europe, which meant kings could say, "See, my family line stretches back to the Ark. Talk about vintage clout, and if anyone doubted your claim." Well, they probably didn't have a better genealogical chart. So you won by default, by the Renaissance. People weren't just repeating flood stories, they were trying to reconcile them with new discoveries. Explorers were coming back with tales of strange lands and even stranger animals. Suddenly, scholars had to explain how kangaroos or armadillos fit into the Ark narrative. Spoiler, not very neatly. Some argued Noah's sons had spread out and taken animals with them, which is funny if you picture Shem dragging llamas across the ocean. Others suggested animals must have migrated miraculously, the divine equivalent of "don't worry about the logistics." Renaissance artists, meanwhile, couldn't resist painting the flood. The Sistine Chapel even has a panel of it. People clinging to rocks, scrambling up trees, while Noah's boxy ark floats smugly in the background. Nothing says holy space like a reminder of mass drowning. By the 1600s, natural philosophery scientists were also obsessed. The flood was their go-to explanation for fossils. Why were seashells found on mountaintops? Easy. Noah's flood left them there. Why were giant bones buried in the ground? Simple. They were from antediluvian giants who drowned. This universal flood explains everything theory held sway for a long time. It wasn't until geology matured in the 18th and 19th centuries that people started saying, maybe there were multiple floods, local ones, spread across millions of years, which, of course, didn't go down well with everyone, but in the meantime, every fossil and odd rock was proudly trotted out as proof that Noah's adventure wasn't just a story. What all this shows is how deeply floods haunted the imagination. Medieval monks turned them into spreadsheets and sermons. Renaissance scholars argued about animal distribution. Early scientists treated them as a catch-all explanation, and kings happily tied their family trees to Noah just to look chosen. It wasn't just a story. It was a cultural obsession that stretched across centuries, across disciplines, and across class lines. From peasants hearing it in church, to rulers using it for propaganda, to scholars writing themselves in circles. Everyone was, in some way, still stuck on that ark. So that's the medieval and Renaissance obsession with Theflet, equal parts piety, propaganda, and logistical fanfiction. By the time we hit the 1700s, the flood story wasn't just a sermon illustration anymore. It had become a battlefield where science, religion, and philosophy collided. You had clergymen clutching their Bibles, gentlemen, scientists, poking at rocks, and a growing sense that the earth was much older than a few generations after Noah. This wasn't just about rain anymore. This was about time, authority, and whether human history was a divine script or a messy natural process. In the 1600s, naturalists had leaned hard on the idea of a universal deluge to explain pretty much everything strange they dug out of the ground. Seashells on mountaintops, Noah's flood, whale bones buried inland. Noah's flood, weird spiral-shaped rocks nobody understood yet, ammonites, flood leftovers. But by the Enlightenment, curious minds started poking holes in this soggy explanation. Nicholas Steno, 1638 to 1686, was one of the first to argue that fossils were once living creatures buried in layers of rock. That meant the earth had a story recorded in stone, not just a single flood event. Robert Hooke, 1635 to 1703, better known for microscopes, also suspected fossils represented entire lost worlds, not just a drowned zoo from Noah's cruise. These guys didn't throw out the flood immediately, but they opened the door to the idea that Earth's history might be far bigger and wetter than the biblical account alone. By the 1700s, European intellectuals were all about reason, skepticism, and poking fun at old certainties. The flood story, once a sacred cornerstone, became a puzzle for armchair geologists and theologians alike. Some Enlightenment thinkers still defended it, but tried to give it a scientific spin. Maybe the flood was caused by a sudden shift of the oceans, or by underground waters bursting forth, or even by a comet passing too close and pulling the seas over the land like some kind of cosmic tide. These were serious proposals, published with straight faces. Others, less polite, mocked the whole thing. Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, ever the troublemaker, suggested that seashells on mountaintops weren't flood debris at all. Maybe, he said, they were just the remains of ancient seabeds lifted up by natural forces. Voltaire was no geologist, but his sarcasm planted seeds. Fast forward to the late 1700s and early 1800s, geology was becoming its own discipline, and the big debate was between two schools of thought. Catastrophism, the belief that Earth's landscape was shaped by sudden, violent events like floods, earthquakes, or volcanic eruptions. Think one big disaster after another. Uniformitarianism, the idea that the same slow processes we see today, sediment buildup, rivers carving valley shad, been shaping the earth for millions of years. The present is the key to the past. At first, catastrophism looked like a friend to the flood story. Georges Cuvier, 1769 to 1832, a French naturalist, argued that the fossil record showed multiple waves of extinction caused by huge floods and disasters. Not one single Noah-style flood, but many floods. He didn't buy the biblical story outright, but he kept the idea of watery cataclysms alive. On the other side was James Hutton, 1726 to 1797, and later, Charles Lyell, 1797 to 1875. These Scottish gentlemen argued that the Earth's features could be explained by slow, steady processes operating over unimaginable spans of time. Mountains weren't carved overnight by a universal flood they rose and eroded over millions of years. Lyell's Principles of Geology became a geology Bible of its own, and Noah's flood started looking more like folklore than fact. Meanwhile, fossils kept turning up and complicating the story. Fossil mammoths in Siberia, giant reptiles in England, seashells in the Alps. If Noah's flood had drowned them all, why were the fossils in neat layers with different creatures in different strata? Why weren't mammoths jumbled up with trilobites and sharks? The neat order of fossils suggested a timeline, and that timeline looked far too long to fit inside a few thousand years since creation. The flood excuse started to crumble. Then came Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882. With On the Origin of Species, 1859, he not only proposed evolution through natural selection, but also leaned heavily on geology. He accepted Lyell's slow processes and deep time. The flood, as a literal global event, didn't fit. Darwin himself wasn't in the business of debunking Bible stories line by line, but his work reinforced the idea that life and earth were the products of gradual, natural change, not one divine soaking. For many Victorian scientists, the flood story was reclassified from natural history to religious myth. It wasn't evidence. It was allegory still. The idea of a global flood never fully disappeared. Victorian society was deeply religious, and plenty of scholars tried to reconcile Genesis with geology. Some argued Noah's flood had been local, not global, a massive regional disaster in Mesopotamia that inspired the story. Others insisted science would eventually catch up and prove the Bible right. Meanwhile, ordinary people clung to the traditional reading. Museums might display fossils, and geology books might dismiss Noah's Ark, but in Sunday schools, children still colored pictures of a smiling boat crammed with giraffes. Victorian artists, like their Renaissance predecessors, couldn't resist painting the flood. But their imagery got darker, more tragic. Instead of just showing the ark bobbing cheerfully, they painted drowning families, desperate animals, and storm-lashed landscapes. The flood was no longer just a children's story. It was an apocalypse on canvas. By the late 19th century, the scientific consensus was clear. Earth was ancient, shaped by slow processes, and the fossil record made no sense if you crammed everything into a single flood. The Enlightenment had cracked the foundation, and Victorian science finished the job, but the cultural pull of the flood remained. It lingered in sermons, in Sunday school lessons, in popular imagination. It became less about geology and more about morality, symbolism, and tradition. So that's the Enlightenment and Victorian chapter. The flood moving from scientific explanation to scientific casualty. By the time the 20th century rolled around, Noah's flood had officially left the halls of geology. Scientists weren't debating it anymore. The Earth was ancient, layered with millions of years of history, and water had shaped it slowly, not with one apocalyptic storm. But outside of lecture halls, the flood story never really retired. It simply found new arena searchology, fundamentalist movements, and eventually the silver screen. The result? A strange modern afterlife where the flood exists as both a myth and a mission. Some people dig for the ark, others look for evidence in mud layers, and a surprising number still insist you can squeeze dinosaurs, cavemen, and every animal onto one giant wooden boat. The early 1900s were a time of exploration and discovery. Archaeologists were busy unearthing ancient Mesopotamian sites like Ur and Nineveh. And what did they stumble across? Flood stories. In 1872, George Smith, a British astronomer, had already shocked Victorian society by translating parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh and finding a flood story older than Genesis. By the 20th century, archaeologists kept digging up more Mesopotamian tablets that spoke of floods, survival, and boats. Suddenly, Noah wasn't alone. He had Mesopotamian cousins. Some scholars concluded that the Genesis flood was just another retelling of older Mesopotamian myths. For believers, this was awkward. For skeptics, it was delicious. Around the same time, the rise of Christian fundamentalism in America gave the flood story new defenders. In the 1920s, when evolution debates were heating up, Scopes trial, Noah's flood became a cornerstone of creation science. The argument went something like this: fossils and rock layers weren't millions of years old, were leftovers from Noah's flood. That's why you find seashells on mountaintops. That's why you find dinosaurs buried in mud. It was all one big, watery grave. Creationist writers like George Macready Price pushed flood geology, claiming the global deluge explained everything mainstream science attributed to deep time. Later, Henry Morris and John Whitcomb popularized the idea in The Genesis Flood, 1961. It became a bestseller in evangelical circles, cementing flood geology as a core part of young Earth creationism. Mainstream scientists rolled their eyes. But the flood had found a new home mine, the trenches of religious culture wars. In the late 20th century, a different angle emerged. Some geologists suggested there really had been a massive regional flood in the ancient Near East, and it might have inspired the biblical and Mesopotamian stories. The most famous was the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. In the 1990s, William, Ryan, and Walter Pittman proposed that around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea broke through the Bosporus and flooded into the Black Sea basin, raising water levels dramatically and drowning early settlements. It wasn't global. It wasn't about arks full of animals. But it was catastrophic enough that survivors might have passed the memory down for generations, until it became the epic flood myths we know. Scientists still debate the scale of this event, but it gave the flood story a new semi-scientific grounding. Not literal, but not purely mythical either. Something in between. Meanwhile, others weren't satisfied with symbolism or local floods. They wanted wood. Real, petrified ark would dot from the 1950s onward. Dozens of expeditions claimed to have found Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat in Turkey, where the Bible says it landed. Every decade brought a new discovery: blurry aerial photos, strange rock formations, or chunks of old timber that mysteriously turned out to be not ancient. One particularly famous site is the so-called Durapanor Formation, a boat-shaped mound near Ararat. Some enthusiasts still insist it's the Ark, though geologists point out it's just a natural rock formation. But logic has never killed arc fever. To this day, there are organizations raising money and sending drones to scan the mountain for proof. Spoiler, they haven't found it. But the dream lives on. If science and religion were wrestling over the flood, Hollywood just saw a blockbuster opportunity. Flood stories have appeared in countless films, from Cecil B. DeMille's biblical epics to animated kids' movies. But the biggest modern example was Darren Aronofsky's Noah 2014. Starring Russell Crowe, it was not exactly Sunday school. This Noah was brooding, paranoid, and willing to consider murdering his own family to obey God's will. There were rock monsters, yes. Actual rock monsters and apocalyptic visuals that looked more like Lord of the Rings than Genesis. Predictably, religious groups hated it. Secular critics weren't sure either. But it proved that even in the 21st century, the flood could still draw headlines and dollars. Beyond Hollywood, the flood shows up everywhere. Children's books still cheerfully depict the Ark as a floating zoo with smiling giraffes poking out the top. Video games reference it. Memes joke about it. And every so often, a news headline pops up. Explorers claim to have found Noah's Ark. Spoiler, again, they haven't. The flood endures because it's flexible. It can be tragic, comedic, moral, or fantastical. It can be science, myth, or movie fodder. Modern geology leaves no room for a global flood. The evidence just isn't there. Rock layers show orderly sequences of life over billions of years, not one chaotic drowning event. Fossils tell a long evolutionary story, not a sudden catastrophe, but regional floods. Those are real. Ancient people lived along rivers that flooded off 10th Tigris, Euphrates, Nile, and Indus. It doesn't take a global event to traumatize a community into telling stories of water sweeping everything away. Multiply that across cultures, and you get the flood myths of the world. So today, scholars tend to treat the flood as a cultural memory of real disasters, reshaped by myth and religion. A story of survival, retold for meaning, not geology. Even in the 21st century, the flood story just won't go away. It has too much symbolic weight. It's about judgment and mercy, destruction and renewal, humanity starting over. It explains why the world feels broken, but also why there's hope for fresh beginnings. And honestly, it's just dramatic. A storm that wipes out the world. That's bedtime storytelling gold. So here we are in modern times, still talking about a flood that science has long since dismissed as literal. From Mesopotamian tablets to Victorian fossils, from evangelical sermons to Russell Crowe's damp, furrowed brow, the flood has had a long afterlife. At this point in our sleepy journey, you've heard the science, the archaeology, the Victorian snarky, and even the Russell Crowe cameo. The flood story has been around for thousands of years, stubbornly refusing to sink. So, why? Why do humans across continents keep telling tales of water drowning the world, only for a handful of people or animals, or God's favorites to survive? It's not like ancient people were running around swapping Netflix spoilers. These myths developed independently in cultures that never met. Yet the story is weirdly universal. That suggests it taps into something deeper than geology. Something in us start with the obvious. Floods are one of the most common natural disasters. Ancient civilizations sprouted near rivers because, well, you need water to farm. But rivers have moods. Sometimes gentle and nourishing, sometimes angry and destructive. If you lived in Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates could overflow and wipe out entire villages. In India, the monsoons still do that. In China, the Yellow River was called China's sorrow for a reason. It flooded disastrously over and over again, so the memory of floods was baked into the human experience. You didn't need imagination. You just needed to survive one really bad rainy season, then exaggerate it a little around the campfire, and suddenly you had a myth about the entire world drowning. On a symbolic level, water has always represented chaos. Think about it. Land is solid, predictable, and controllable. Water is shifting, bottomless, Ancient people looked at the ocean and saw danger, mystery, and the unknown. So when you tell a story about the gods pressing the reset button, of course you choose water as the weapon. Fire burns, earthquakes shake, but water erases. It washes the world blank, like chalk off a slate. That's a powerful metaphor. Here's the ironic part. Flood myths aren't just about death. They're also about rebirth. Sure, most of humanity gets drowned, but the survivors become the seeds of a new world. It's tragic, but also hopeful. It's basically humanity's reboot button. Psychologists suggest flood stories are comforting in a strange way. They acknowledge destruction, but they promise survival. Someone always makes it through. The ark lands. The waters recede. The rainbow appears. Life begins again. That fresh start message has a deep pull. Who doesn't secretly want to wash away the mess and start over? Another universal theme. Floods come as punishment. Humanity messes up. The gods get cranky. The waters rise. It's a neat narrative package. Floods are terrifying, but they're also just. You can blame them on divine judgment, not just random bad weather. And they teach a moral lesson. Behave, or risk another soaking. In Mesopotamia, the gods flooded the world because humans were too noisy. In the Bible, it was wickedness. In Hindu mythology, Vishnu sends the flood, but saves Manu, the righteous man. Different cultures, same template, water as judgment, survival as reward. Enter Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, with a fondness for myths and symbols. Jung argued that stories like floods are archetypes, universal images embedded in the human psyche. The flood, in his view, symbolized the unconscious, overwhelming the conscious, order drowned by chaos. But then, from the chaos, new order arises. It's not just a story about water. It's about the human mind and its cycles of destruction and renewal. Whether you buy Jung or not, the flood certainly feels archetypal. You don't need to know Mesopotamian cuneiform to resonate with the image of overwhelming water and fragile survival. There's also a practical reason. Flood myths endure. They're easy to tell. Simple plot, dramatic imagery, clear moral. That's why children's Bibles almost always include Noah's Ark. Forget Leviticus. Forget genealogies. But a giant boat full of giraffes, bobbing on stormy seas, with a rainbow at the end. Perfect bedtime material, of course. The darker parts, like drowning everyone else, get skipped. Kids get the cute animals and the happy rainbow, not the mass extinction, which is probably for the best if you want them to sleep. Even in a secular world, the flood sticks around as a metaphor. Climate change. Politicians warn of rising seas and a flood of refugees. Personal struggles. People talk about being drowned in work or keeping their head above water. Pop culture, every apocalypse movie has its own flood variant. Zombies, asteroids, alien invasions, but the template is the same. wipeout. Survival, reboot. The flood story is elastic. It can be literal, mythical, or metaphorical. That's why it keeps getting recycled. Here's the final irony. A story about the near destruction of humanity somehow makes great bedtime material. Why? Because the flood story has rhythm. The rising waters, the ark adrift, the slow receding, the calm after the storm. It's like breathing, in, out, destruction, renewal, and unlike other myths where the gods are cruel or random, the flood has a clear arc. Punishment, survival, promise. It reassures us that even chaos has a cycle. Even disaster ends. In a way, the flood myth is the world's oldest lullaby. So here we are, hours later, still afloat in a sea of myths, fossils, arguments, and bedtime tangents. And somehow, the flood story still hasn't sunk. It started as an ancient memory, turned into a sacred warning, became a battlefield for geology, and then morphed into Sunday school coloring pages and Hollywood CGI spectacles. That's a pretty long life for one storm. Think back to where we began. Ancient Mesopotamians scratching their flood tales on clay tablets. Gods grumbling about noisy humans, unleashing storms, and picking one lucky guy to build a boat. That story floated down the centuries into Genesis, where Noah took the role of obedient boat builder. Then it sailed into Greek myths, Indian epics, Chinese legends, and more. Fast forward a few millennia, and you're watching Russell Crowe glower on a big screen while rock monsters defend the ark. Same story, different special effects budget. The continuity is weirdly comforting. If the flood teaches anything, it's not really about water. It's about humans trying to explain why life feels fragile. Why disasters happen. Why, after everything washes away, something survives. Flood stories give shape to chaos. They tell us there's meaning behind the mess. Even if that meaning is just don't annoy the gods too much. They also sneak in a promise. No matter how bad the storm, someone makes it through. And that's why the myth doesn't die. Because we still crave that promise. Geology, of course, has long since moved on. The Earth is billions of years old, shaped by patient, slow processes. Fossils aren't a drowned zoo. Floodwaters didn't carve the Grand Canyon in a single season. Noah's Ark didn't park neatly on Mount Ararat. Science gently set the ark aside, but culture refused. Today, the flood is less about what really happened and more about what it means. Climate change. Rising seas are described as a new flood. Personal struggles. You're drowning in work. Even politics leans on the imagery. A flood of protests. A tidal wave of change. The flood remains our go-to metaphor for being overwhelmed and then trying to start fresh in the end. What lingers isn't the drowning. It's the rainbow. The idea that after chaos, after loss, something calm and promising appears. That little streak of color is what makes the story bearable, even soothing. It turns mass extinction into bedtime reassurance, which is why you can fall asleep to it tonight. The flood washes over, the waters recede, the ark rests, and the rainbow shines. Humanity begins again. So let's step off the ark together. We've slogged through Mesopotamian myths, medieval monks, Enlightenment skeptics, Victorian fossil hunters, 20th century ark chasers, and Jungian archetypes. We've laughed gently at the half-baked theories and nodded sleepily at the metaphors. And now, finally, the waters are calm. The storm has passed. Good night, The flood story has been with us for thousands of years, and it'll probably be with us for thousands more. People will keep telling it, reimagining it, painting it, filming it, teaching it to kids with cartoon giraffes. Because in the end, it's not about whether it happened, it's about why we need it. So tonight, as you drift off, remember, the world has ended many times in our imagination. But in those same stories, it always begins again. Sleep well. The ark is steady. The waters are low. And tomorrow there's dry land.